Our industry is moving faster than ever. Where are freight volumes headed? How will this affect capacity? And of course, what's the newest technology that can benefit your business? Those questions and many more will be answered at the industry's hottest freight tech conference this November in Chicago. Come join us at FreightWaves Live November 12th and 13th at the McCormick Center. Visit FreightWavesLive.com to register.
Time for your Wednesday edition of FreightWaves Now. I got some really exciting stuff today, but first, let's hear from Nick Austin with the weather.
Welcome to FreightWays Weather for your Wednesday. I'm FreightWays meteorologist Nick Austin. A lot of weather happening in the same parts of the country as we've had all week. We're going to have a snowstorm moving into the Midwest. Although it was in the Rockies earlier this week, still a lot of wildfires causing problems out in California. And we still have a cyclone out about halfway across the world, and we'll talk about that as well. Could affect some ports. But first we'll talk about the snowstorm, this impending snowstorm that's developing. It's going to be heading into parts of the Midwest from later today through Halloween. Some Mother Nature scaring up just a little bit of scary weather here, some frightening weather. It's not going to be a huge storm as far as a widespread blizzard. It's going to last for, say, a whole day or two. But we're talking about some heavy snow developing later today through the evening hours from around eastern Nebraska and up into parts of Iowa and northern Missouri. This includes near Kansas City, where there could be a little bit of freezing rain at the beginning of this event, and then up towards Davenport, Des Moines, and then late tonight, heading into the Halloween holiday, is when it's going to be spreading up towards near Chicago. Probably not a lot of snow right in downtown Chicago, but just north of town and heading up into Wisconsin, including Madison, Milwaukee. So the highest snow amounts could be anywhere from 7 to 10 inches. Which will be from northern Missouri and up into parts of Iowa and into Illinois in a small band where they're going to see some of those heavier amounts. But more common, we'll see about 2 to 5 inch snow totals out of this through late tonight. But the winds are going to be picking up, and that could cause a problem as far as maybe delaying some air freight into O'Hare and up into Milwaukee, Rockford Airport as well. And of course, there'll be a lot of just snowy and icy roads, including patches of interstate highways. So truckers will have to be aware of that heading through those areas from late today into the nighttime hours. And a lot of the cold air with this storm is going to sink all the way down into Texas, even near central Texas by tomorrow morning. We're talking about freezing cold weather. Now we'll go back out to the west coast. Still a lot of wildfires across California. The largest wildfire at about 77,000 acres rather is the Kincaid fire, which is north of San Francisco. It's just north of the Santa Rosa area right up in here. And there are still a lot of closures along US 101 up in that part of Northern California. Luckily, the winds here will be dying down later today, but there could be gusts of anywhere from about 30 to 50 miles an hour, so that could spread fires really quickly. The extremely dry conditions, you could see new fires sparking, but still a lot of power outages across California. And these are intentional power outages because Pacific Gas and Electric doesn't want live wires that might get blown down by the wind to start new fires. So these are what are called public safety power outages affecting San Francisco metro area, a lot of interior California, northern and eastern parts of California, and some of the mountain areas as well. Now down near Los Angeles, it's the Getty fire. That's a much smaller fire, maybe about 1/100th of the size of the Kincaid fire up in Northern California, but the winds are going to be strongest in Southern California. There are closures right now because the fire is close to the 405, so right along I-405 there are a lot of closures as well, and there'll be a lot of problems with more problems with wind here because the winds will be stronger in Southern California. We're talking about gusts possibly of 60 to 80 miles per hour with sustained winds of about 30 to 50 miles per hour. So a bigger problem with winds around the Los Angeles area, other parts of Southern California, and they're going to have to watch out for that. That's going to affect air travel as well. There'll probably be delays and cancellations with air cargo and with just passenger planes as well. So and the winds down in Southern California, they should be dying out later this evening towards around midnight hour Pacific time. So that's good news. It's just really hard to battle those fires and keep them under control when the winds are that strong. Now we're going to go back out to the Arabian Sea again, talking about Cyclone Kiar. This is not going to make direct landfall. It'll stay offshore over the next few days of the coast of Oman and Yemen, but we have talked to some port authorities here in Oman, and although there's going to be some storm surge here. There'll be some strong wind gusts, even though it's not going to make direct landfall. Some ports are closing. Other local supply chains just along the coast of Oman and possibly Yemen are going to be closing down and will be affected here over the next few days. Luckily, the strongest winds are going to be well out to sea, but it's close enough to the coast that there could be some problems here over the next few days. That's what you need to know about your weather for your Wednesday. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to get all of our videos. We have more information on Cyclone Kiara on our website as well, FreightWaves.com. Have a great Wednesday and be careful out there.
Welcome to your Wednesday Carrier Update, sponsored by PowerFleet. My name is Kyle Cunningham. Thanks so much for joining me today. First off, let's take a look at a map of the entirety of the USA. And first, we're going to look at the Outbound Tender Volume Index, and then we're going to take a look at the concept of the outbound rejections matching up within the USA as well. So first off, outbound tender volume, no surprise that out west, LA and Ontario are going to lead the pack in terms of big markets moving out. And on the East Coast, Atlanta and Harrisburg are going to be taking the cake on that one. So what does this mean in regards to outbound tender rejects coming through the country? Well, you can see that there's a little bit of an elevation down here. LA experiencing a little bit of a capacity crunch. Out here in Atlanta, no question there, it's very low. The carriers are not in any sort of control. Same story up in the Northeast, pretty light on outbound rejections. Where you want to try and route your capacity is to the middle of the country here. You can see right up and down from the bottom of Louisiana all the way to the top of North Dakota, an extreme lack of capacity. The darker the blue, the stronger you can possibly find the rates in these markets. So keep that in mind. If you can't make it to the center of the country, out west, there's still a lot going on out there. With everything cooling down, you might be able to throw some potatoes into a dry van if you got some vents on that one. Let's take down south, look at Albuquerque, New Mexico. Talked about this one last week, had the box right here saying, hey, this might continue to go past. Well, it dropped down a little bit over the weekend as of Wednesday today, approaching 10%, extremely favorable to carriers in Albuquerque, a real anomaly outside of the normal sub 5% outbound tender rejects. So keep an eye on this one. We got the inbound volume almost double the outbound volume, so a lot of inbound capacity. It's going to be fighting for these good rates in regards to the outbound tender rejects. So moving over to Greensboro, North Carolina, talk about some reefer to close it out. You can see the blue mountain here, your reefer outbound tender rejects inside of Greensboro, 160.66% up from yesterday to 11.86. So huge moves. Volume in terms of refrigerated outbound in Greensboro, relatively flat throughout the course of the year, but as this day starting to jump back up again to those kind of mid-September levels. As always, thanks so much for watching your carrier update. I'll see you tomorrow. Time again for your finance update with Seth Holm. A really interesting chart behind me here talking about the concept of revenue and margins. Please tell me more about this.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. So what we did at the Freight Intel Group, I just put together a white paper that'll be out in the next couple days for Sonar subscribers, so be on the lookout at that. But what we did is we took a look at freight broker performance across the cycle. So if you think about a freight broker, we kind of talked about this, and it's a long paper, but there's three overall drivers of revenue for a freight broker. There is the number of loads that they're booking, there's the average revenue per load, and then there's their mix of contractual and spot revenue, right? And then if you subtract from that the cost of purchase transportation, they go out and they source those carriers, then you have your gross margins. So what I've done today on my chart today is I put together models, basic model looking at key metrics for brokers going back over the last 4 or 5 years, the top 5 publicly traded brokers where we get all this data. And so what you have here, a couple interesting takeaways, and I wanted to preview the stuff that we talked about in the paper. In the blue line, we have gross revenue growth for the overall basket of freight brokers. As you can see here, 2016 was a down market, right? And so gross revenue hit a trough of about negative 20% for the broker basket in Q4 of 2016, right? The freight markets recovered, and all of a sudden, freight brokers as a whole in this index got all the way up to 30% revenue growth, right? And then the market turned down and gross revenue has turned down. So gross revenue overall tends to trend pretty well with the overall trucking market, both volumes and pricing. But they have an interesting element to their gross margins because they have a majority of their business is contractual, these publicly traded guys, that they have interesting effects. Early on in the cycle, their gross margins, which is in red, they tend to get squeezed early on in the cycle because that's where we are right now. What happens is spot rates bottom out and they start to slowly climb up while contract rates are coming down, and that squeezes their margins. However, late in the cycle, as you can see here, right when revenue growth peaked at 30% year over year, gross margins for the index bottomed at 15.4%. And then while the market was rolling over, they have this late cycle cushion embedded in their business models where their gross margins expanded by 200 basis points. So we kind of go into this in more depth looking forward, but now we're entering the early part of the cycle again, where we think freight brokers' margins are going to be squeezed at a time of late volumes, and that's what we've seen in the earnings reports lately.
Thanks so much for that perspective. As always, you've got to pay attention to these finance updates. You're not going to find anything else anywhere more comprehensive than Seth Holm's update. We'll see you next week. Now it's time for your brokerage update with Donny Gilbert talking about what's happening. I heard something about pecans out west, but what do you got first going on?
We're going to start with we're going to look at our national volumes again. They're starting to trend upwards. We like to see them over 10,000.
Yep.
We're like 99, 82. So we're on the way there,
right.
But they are trending in an upward direction. So hopefully by tomorrow they'll be above 10,000, and that's where we want to be. I want to see it continue to climb as we enter the fourth quarter right now. Looking at this, we also have our reefer tender rejection rates here in the yellow. They started to drop down here in the beginning of October. They're also starting to pick back up. We're around 14.69%. So that's a very healthy rate for reefer tender rejection rates. I mean, on an average, their rates are well over contracted rates for the reefer market. Drive-in, they're still very, very low. They're 4.71%, but they've started to pick up. They've been increasing them very, very slowly, and we've seen that over the past few weeks. So we're hoping as well as we get into this fourth quarter, we want to see drive-in tender rejection rates pick up. We'd like to see them at 10% or higher, and we're working on that. It's just a very slow pace. Looking here is a national map of our outbound drive-in tender rejection rates. That's where we see our pecans. Right here, Albuquerque, New Mexico. That's been a market that it's a tough market to work out of. It's fairly low volumes, but it's a very hot market for pecans. Tender rejection rates are running 15% for drive-ins. So if you can actually get into this market, you can haul some pecans out of there and make some pretty good money out of this market. Around the rest of the country, we still have our hot spots throughout the Midwest, but we're seeing some more markets kind of starting to pick up in the Northeast. And this is an area that's struggled all year long. They've had tender rejection rates well below the 4%, where basically their spot markets have been below the contracted rates, and you've had a lot of shippers moving their stuff through the spot market instead of honoring these contracts. So here we're starting to see it pick up here. We have some that are picking up 5, 6, and even some to 7. Around here in Erie, PA, that's up to almost 9% for tender rejection rates. So that's a growth that we want to see as well, looking at from a broker perspective or carrier perspective. For shippers, that means your rates are increasing in this area. So they prefer the low rates. They don't like high tender rejection rates. Looking at one more market here, this is a market, Boston, in the Northeast. We've seen here over the last few weeks, our outbound tender volumes are starting to pick up here, and this has helped carry our drive-in tender rejection rates up. They've climbed to 7.03%. This is the highest tender rejection rate we've seen in Boston since February, and that's actually when the market was coming down. So here, all since February till now, we've had tender rejection rates 4% or lower. So this is a very good news for the drive-in out of the Boston market. Reefers picked up some, but it's at 1.39%. That's very, very low. Below that 3% right now, tender spot market for reefer right now is pretty well below your contract rates in the market for Boston. So right now, probably good for brokers to try to find freight for reefer that gets them out of that market. Or if you're a reefer carrier, you might want to cut that reefer off and start looking for drive-in freight.
Welcome to another edition of the Drayage Update in partnership with Next. I'm Emily Zink, joined by maritime expert Henry Byers. Henry, we have talked about the trade wars and how that's affecting shipping. We've talked about port expansions. Today we're talking about chassis. They are a major part of drayage and so important. Why are they so important to the process?
It's what enabled containers, to move from the ports, the terminals, to the doors, whether that be a receiver, a warehouse. It provides the over-the-road transportation. So essentially, without a chassis, the containers can't be delivered.
They're so important. They need to get delivered, but sometimes there's a shortage. Talk about that.
Yeah, an issue recently has been the amount of time that shippers, BCOs, are keeping the containers and chassis at their docks. So when a container delivers to a DC, it's on the chassis. It's got to be dock high, just as if it were a 53-foot drive-in, backed up all the way to the doors. And a lot of times the contracts that they negotiate with the ocean carriers can include what they know is what's known as 14 free days at destinations. So they have those containers sometimes 14 days before they're fully unloaded and travel back to the port. So that entire time, that chassis also being kept out that long. So if you have enough shippers, enough BCOs keeping enough of these containers and chassis outside the port, outside the terminal, they can't be used for another load.
And some ports are getting pretty creative. I know you said the Port of Charleston, is now doing chassis off-site.
Yeah, so I think everyone's looking at how can we do this more efficiently. About 10 years ago, the chassis, which were largely owned by ocean carriers, they basically said, okay, we're going to divest, we're going to allow independent chassis providers to now, own a majority of the chassis and manage this. It's almost a separate process. Well, ports like the Port of Charleston, Port of Virginia, really every port's looking at how can we do this more efficiently. And Charleston said, we're going to move these off-site and create really a pool of chassis that, a number of different private owners can be involved in, kind of like a co-op, a gray pool as they're sometimes known, just to make that more efficient, because basically you're able to pick up chassis, get containers from different ocean carriers, return the chassis to those locations. So it just makes it more efficient. You don't have what's known as a chassis split fee or anything like that.
We talked about some issues with chassis and also another creative way to kind of manage this process. What are some other things that forwarders and shippers are doing?
Well, in my opinion, if it's all about the chassis, because without a chassis, you're not able to deliver the containers. I think doing things like tracking the chassis directly makes a lot of sense. If you look at someone like American Intermodal Management, they're actually, that's their approach. So they're building brand new chassis, so they know that they're up to date. They know that they're, not 17, 18 years old, going down the road with potential problems. And they're GPS tracking them. So they're enabling BCOs, freight forwarders, MBOCCs to have greater visibility. By tracking those chassis, you're in turn tracking those containers. So if the containers are tracked on the vessels coming in, they have a good idea of what's happening, what time they arrive, then they have greater visibility on that door delivery portion, which is also oftentimes one of the most important pieces.
Why do you think it's taken so long for something like GPS tracking to happen, and why more companies aren't doing it?
There's a few things. Number one, I think just the drayage industry overall, from a tracking standpoint, often gets overlooked. Like I say, if you have to have a chassis to deliver a container, I think it's one of the things that makes the most sense. I've really always thought that, because if you're tracking that chassis, that's always there at the terminal. It's only moving regionally so far. You just have so much better visibility in it. And like I say, if you know that it's at a receiver's door, then it's got a container on there and what time it returns. So in terms of bringing greater visibility to that process and the fees that are incurred sometimes bringing greater visibility and accountability between those parties involved, I think is super important. But another thing I would mention is just there's so many different players involved. Now that the ocean carriers are largely out of the chassis game, you have a lot of these independent providers who they're competitive. So, in that competition, it's hard for them to really share resources, share data, and it's just taken a while. But I think, with people like American Intermodal Management, they're kind of leading the way. And I think if they can really prove out that it makes a lot of sense, and they can prove that it adds a lot of value to the end user, I think you'll see a lot of people follow suit.
As always, Henry Byers, extremely insightful. If you want to look for more drayage updates in partnership with Next, just head to FreightWaves.com.